Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Nice rah-rah music. I feel fired up. Good way to start us off. My name is Gerard Robinson. I'm a senior fellow at the Miller Center, and in this role, I'm excited to invite all of you in our in-person office and audience, and for those of you who are watching us live, thank you for being here to have a conversation with three people to talk about the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. But before I introduce our speakers, I also want to take a few minutes to thank people who made today possible. I want to thank Alfred Reeds, the fourth in the back, handsome gentleman who you'll see walking through the audience today with a card, so make sure you complete that. I also want to thank the Miller AV and communications team for the work they do, and want to broadly thank the Miller leadership team, staff, custodial staff, and others who keep this place running well. But let me give a special thank you to the university-wide MLK Community Celebration Committee, because not only today here at the Miller Center, but throughout grounds, we're celebrating his life. And so this is a partnership effort. And of course, he was someone who believed in the power of partnerships. Now, whenever we talk about Dr. King, we tend to think about his life solely through the lens of civil rights, and that's very important. But we often overlook the fact that he believed that you couldn't have civil rights without an educated population and the role that education played. I remember reading an article that he published as a 17-year-old student at Morehouse College, where he talked about the meaning of education and its purpose. I can tell you as a high school student at 17, I was not thinking very deeply about the meaning of education, but he was. And so we have three people today who are going to talk to us about education who walk on the same turf that he did, but do through different lanes. So first we have to my left, Emily Dickinson, who in fact her first time to University of Virginia, so glad to welcome her on grounds. Chief Administrative Officer at SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management. She has not only a career in higher ed, but she's seen what a workforce looks like, and she's going to tell us a few things about her work. Next to her is Dr. Derek Ulrich. He is a professor at the UVA School of Education and Human Development. He's going to talk to us about higher education. And next to him is Professor Kimberly Robinson from the UVA School of Law, and she's going to talk to us about education, K-12 and law. So with that, we're going to start off with our first question. And just so you'll know, for Run a Show, I've got three general questions. Once we are done, we're going to turn it open to the audience for questions, and we can take it from there. So Emily is our guest. Welcome.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And Gerard, thanks for the opportunity. I just realized this is the first time I've been on a panel related to MLK Day. You know, do all the volunteer service on there, but so this is an absolute privilege. So you have a question for me?
I sure do.
Okay.
She and I used to work together at the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, so a shout out to the leadership for that organization as well. So what attracted you to the profession that you're in right now? Tell us a little more, because as she and I were talking, you can read someone's resume and not know their revelation. What was your revelation?
I will say this role found me.
Okay.
I'm a native New Yorker. I went to college in the South at North Carolina Central University, went to law school there, and ended up in local government, working in one of the most liberal towns in America. We'll call it Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where they pay really, really high taxes, and so their expectations are really high. So working in the mayor's office, I heard it all, but also people who were just really interested in making sure that everyone had access to everything, which was important. Left there and went to work on one of the campuses in the University of North Carolina system, and then ultimately worked in the system office doing federal affairs as AVP of federal affairs. Ended up in DC 10 years ago, and was happy working in issues related to access to higher education. Growing up first generation college, in my household it was, if you get a good education, you will get a good job, you will be good, and you will do better than my parents. My mom has a high school diploma. My dad had a 7th grade education, yet one of the smartest people that I absolutely knew. And so I early on knew the difference between being smart and education. And you can, as my mother would say, you can have all the book sense in the world, but if you don't have any common sense, that's a problem. So, and was really happy in that space, took the leap to be a VP of Federal Affairs Public Policy for an association of governing boards of colleges and universities. So stayed in that higher education space and then ended up at Thurgood Marshall as the GC, and was really happy to get out of government affairs because by then we had no earmarks and people had started not getting along because there were no bargaining chips and it wasn't fun. Got to Thurgood Marshall, and on the first day as GC, our head of government affairs quit. And our CEO looked at me and said, I guess government affairs is reporting to you here. So could not run away from it. Okay. Ultimately, he got a job at SHRM, Society for Human Resources Management, largest HR association in the world. 340,000 members, 180 countries, chapters, and state councils every state. And when he told me I was coming with him, I wasn't asked, I was told I was coming with him. I struggled because I kept saying every day I've been able to do something that provided access to education for those who didn't normally have access. In the HBCU space, that was critically important. What in the world could I add value to for HR? It just didn't. It took me a while. And I remember seeing that we had a separate 501c3, and I said, oh, I know what I'm going to do when I go to SHRM. I'll just work for the 501c3. And he said, no. And so I ended up as chief of staff, and ultimately now I'm CAO with 5 divisions reporting to me. But ultimately, I had this moment when I had to address our first crowd of members where I realized that HR changes lives.
Yes.
Remember, your first promotion, someone in HR. Your professional development, someone in HR had to nominate you or identify the opportunity. When you get a raise, it comes from, your manager says it, but HR had to make it happen. They change lives and livelihoods every day, but they don't know it and they don't get the respect for it. And so what I could do is lend that same voice that I had been using for years to advocate for access to higher education to now advocate on behalf of the people who change lives every day at that next step post higher education. What I've realized in the last couple of years is that education and employment are sitting here, and at the center is HR. But they've not, either of them, come to HR and say, how can you help us to strengthen this education to employment pipeline? Mm-hmm. And we can talk about that further, but really now I feel like we have this new E-Square initiative, Education to Employment. We are absolutely focusing our state councils, our chapter, our policy work on closing and repairing a pipeline that we say is leaky, busted, and broken, yet the best in the world. Right? Because you got to say still, but it's leaky, busted, broken, and it's K-12, it's higher ed, but it's also untapped talent pools, and we can talk about that too. So I'm really excited to be here and talk more because I feel like I've finally gotten in that role where I can merge all that experience on education side with my work side. Plus, I'm married to a K-8 administrator. My husband is a former English teacher who is an assistant principal. And so you can imagine our pillow talk is very much about that whole spectrum of what is not happening at the K-8 level that's not preparing our students who ultimately want to go on to have a good career and take care of their families.
It's interesting when you talked about the importance of HR and leadership. We often forget that Dr. King also not only was a pastor of a church that required HR and leadership, but Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the role in that, he once said, I just wanted to preach. And now you have to lead, so good HR part. Dr. Aldrich, you are involved in higher education. Dr. King, like you, holder of a PhD. Most people forget that he's one of the few people in the United States at that time with a PhD. Talk to us about your aha and revelation to become a professor.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me just start with, I was born during the Civil Rights Movement and the 1960s, but I came of age in the 1970s. I grew up and was born in a small town that many of you probably have never heard of called Rock Hill, South Carolina.
Okay. Rock Hill. Yeah.
Many people from Rock Hill say that they're from Charlotte because it's about 20 minutes south, but I'm from Rock Hill, and I claim that. And my mother was a teacher for 40 years. My uncle was a special education teacher, and most of my aunts were teachers. So I came from a family of teachers. And then I went to a little small church in Catawba, South Carolina, where I would say at least a quarter of the members in there were teachers. So I grew up around teachers, and inevitably I became a teacher, and my brother became a teacher. It was meant to be. Went to college and went through college right there in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and learned when I went to Winthrop that Winthrop's first black graduate was a woman named Cynthia Plarati, who I'd known all my life growing up. She was a member of my church. And her son was one of my best friends. I didn't find that out until later. And so I became fascinated with the role that teachers played in the civil rights movement. And I took a course at Winthrop College, and I asked the question, I said, where are the teachers in the civil rights movement? I can't find anything in these textbooks that we're reading. And my professor, I remember him clearly telling me, maybe you should study that. So I put that in the back of my mind. And eventually I would become a high school teacher, well, middle school and a high school teacher. I was on the faculty at the University of Georgia for 14 years, where I started an oral history project called the Foot Soldier Project. And the term was actually a term that Dr. King used to describe the everyday people in the movement who pushed the movement forward. And during those interviews, we interviewed a few teachers who were actually involved in the movement. It made me really think about the teachers in my hometown. But it wasn't until I arrived at the University of Virginia in 2011 that I began to think seriously about the role of teachers in the civil rights movement. And I did a deep dive into the literature, the historiography, so to speak, and found that there was very little out there. And in fact, some scholars argued that teachers were not active in the movement, and a few even argued that they were complicit in maintaining segregation because they did not want to lose their jobs at the segregated schools. And I said, wow. So, wrote a grant a few years later and received it, was lucky, blessed to receive it. And I hired a number of my undergraduate and graduate students to come work with me during the summers. We put cameras on our backs and we went to little small towns throughout Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. And we conducted 500 videotaped interviews of teachers across the South. And what we found was that teachers were involved in the movement. Maybe not necessarily as activists on the streets and in protests, but they were involved as pedagogical activists, or as the historian Jarvis Gibbons would say, they were engaged in what was called fugitive pedagogy. So that's been my life's work for the last few years. And I am glad that I took this journey. In Lynchburg a few years ago, when we were doing this presentation, a woman stopped me as I was leaving, and she said, young man, I wasn't really a young man, but she said, young man, I appreciate it. She said, young man, what you're doing is important work. That's spirit work. That's soul work that you're doing. And that always stuck with me. And I feel like this is my life's work. So the stories of these teachers are very important. And I'd like to say that some of these teachers that I interviewed actually knew Dr. King. And I'm going to talk about that later. So that's how I come to this work on teachers. That's how I come to view the role on teachers in the movement.
Great story from an educator and a family of educators. Septima Clark is by some considered the mother of the civil rights movement. We know very little about her, but she was one of the people who in Tennessee, she was working with an integrated group of people to talk to them about the importance of democracy. One of the young students who went through her program, you know her today because of her refusal to stand up on a bus or to give up her seat, Rosa Parks. But Dr. King spent time with her as well. And so when you're thinking about teachers, he will tell you, I had great professors, but it was a Septima Clark who we often overlook, who was equally important. So thank you for keeping that tradition. Professor Robinson, you've had a chance to see education practitioner for law and also as a scholar. What was your aha?
Yeah, so I really come to this work from a family of people who were very committed to civil rights. So my dad was a civil rights attorney. He worked for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and also did civil rights work for Department of Agriculture and other federal agencies. And then my mother was actually participated in the March on Washington and filed a housing discrimination claim when she went to rent something in Washington, D.C., and they said, it's not available when the sign clearly showed it was. And so I just grew up around the dinner table really hearing about civil rights because my dad would talk about his work. And I saw law as a way to help people and to serve. And so I wanted to follow in his footsteps, always wanted to find a profession that would help people, so I saw law as that profession. And so, but I wanted to go be a human rights lawyer because I thought my parents' generation, civil rights movement, had really taken care of all the civil rights issues. I was young and idealistic, and I was just confident that his generation had it under control, right? Because I was hearing about how it was being handled at the dinner table. And so I came to the University of Virginia for college and took classes with the amazing professors such as Julian Bond, who helped me to see that much work was left to be done. And I did an internship actually in Richmond at the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, and I had an attorney challenge me, a defense attorney. He said, "Why are you going overseas to defend people's rights? People's rights are violated in the United States every single day, and you can be part of solving that." And so that stuck with me. I mean, I was, maybe 20 when he said that to me, and I still remember that exact conversation. And so that was one of my aha moments. And then another one was, my parents moved us when we were 9 from one state to Virginia and explicitly told us, and it was during the middle of the school year, to get a better education. They said, "We are not happy with what's happening here for your education." My brother was experiencing some difficult bullying, and they said, "We just don't feel like this is on the path we want you to be on, and education is so important that we're willing to move." And they left job opportunities being behind. My mother left her sister behind, and our cousins and family, but that was what was more important, was to get their children a quality education. And so later, as I learned more about civil rights and inequality and kind of the state of our education system, the question came to me sort of, why do you have to move to get a better education? Like, why should any child have to leave their close family and friends? Because, a move is a hard thing for a kid. You remember it. It's a very pivotal moment. And so, then I thought, where would I be if we had not moved? If my parents hadn't insisted that I needed higher quality schools? And so fast forward, I went to UVA for college, and I went to Harvard for law school, and I planned to go into education ultimately, and represented school districts at a firm that's now called Hogan Lovells, but ultimately wanted to go work in the federal government, one, because I'd seen that example with my father, and two, when I was representing school districts, we were always looking for what the federal government was saying. So I was like, well, why don't I go work on what you're looking, what everyone's looking to hear what they have to say. And so I did practice civil rights law for 5 years, and then started to really question the system of, why is this education system so broken? Why do families need to move who can to get a better education, and how can this be better? And so that's really the work of a scholar. And so I ended up going out to become a professor. I'm now proud to be at the University of Virginia School of Law, and I also founded and direct the Education Rights Institute, where we examine these issues. So really excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity, Professor Robinson, and looking forward to the conversation.
When Dr. King was at the signing ceremony for the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, people overlooked the fact that he was really excited when Johnson supported the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, as well as the Higher Education Act as well. So March on Washington has already come up in our conversation. We have made synonymous March on Washington, Dr. King, I Have a Dream. And some of us know that he actually had delivered that speech before. What we don't make synonymous is March on Washington for jobs and freedom. He was talking about jobs. Civil rights, important, so were civil rights. And so, Emily, for you, jobs. He talked a lot about the importance of economic mobility, the importance of a great wage. A lot of entrepreneurs were in his community. Talk to us about the work that you're doing that's advancing his ideas that even led to the whole idea of a March on Washington for jobs and freedom.
So I think you'll hear me say there are two terms we talk about a lot at SHRM: the dignity of work and lives and livelihoods. Okay. And for all of that, you need a job. And here, for whatever reason, 90% of us are not trust fund babies, and we need to work for now.
Yes.
Right. So the issue is, where can you, first it used to be like getting access to the job that helps you with your life and your livelihood. I think now what we're seeing is that there is going to be a huge loss of jobs because of this new technology that we're all generally calling AI. But we've been doing automation in some form. It's just a new industrial revolution. And our response to that is going to challenge everything that we've known about access to work and what jobs look like. And so traditionally, we've gotten jobs by obtaining certain skills that would allow us to go in a job. And for many people who've gone into government work, federal work, or even different types of work that require heavy labor, and that's been it. You can sit in that role for a very long time. I'm so proud. My mom worked in a hospital for 33 years, and that was the thing, right? You worked for 33 years, you come out with a really good pension. For her being in New York City, between pension and retirement, she lived better and lives better now with all of those things. That's not the case because we don't see employers providing pensions, and 401k requires you to guide that and things of that nature. And now here we come where AI and the technology around it could displace some of the most basic jobs that provided entree into the workforce. And so right now we have to think about what does a job really mean. And I think then it was an entree into living a life that was supposed to, around 50 retire, take care of your kids, get them to a level where they can then get a job that's even better.
Correct.
We've over-focused, and this is somebody who's got 3 degrees, so I can even say this. We have over-focused on the degree and left ourselves vulnerable in now trying to market to people who've only heard you must get a degree to be successful, to now trying to convince them that a blue-collar job is just as good, if not better in some cases, and you got less debt, right? We've created this PR problem. So we find ourselves with a PR problem to get people to do the jobs that likely AI won't take. And I'll give you a good example about an industry, healthcare. So SHRM has a huge research arm. We've been trying to say, what does AI displacement look like in different industries? If you take healthcare, take a radiologist. Everybody knows what the radiologist does. They look at those x-rays. And so going forward, we are likely, without regulation to say that you can't do it, let me put that caveat, you'll need fewer radiologists because the machine can tell you all the normal x-rays. The radiologist will be the one to look more carefully at the ones that have abnormalities and get those onto the next stage. But you'll need fewer people because the normal ones are just going to go right on through, right? But so that's one part of the healthcare industry chain. At the other end, the lower paid end, which we're going to have to figure out how to handle that, people are aging and living longer.
Yes.
Chronic diseases, Alzheimer's and all sorts of disease with paralysis and things of that nature require human-to-human care. The machine can't lift you from the bed and turn you over. The machine can't do your physical therapy because you still need the physical therapist. You need the HSA, which is the home health aide. You need the CNA, which is a certified. You need all of that. And right now, those are the jobs where there's going to be lots of opportunity. But guess what? Those are the jobs we've told most Americans don't matter because you get paid less than $20 an hour. We talk about the negative part of those jobs, right? The cleaning after someone who's older and can't control. But we don't talk about the fact that what you're doing and what we see in other countries is the reverence and respect for being able to take care of older people as they transition into that way of life. And so who are the people taking care of people now who are in those roles? Immigrants. The ladies that take care of my mom, right? Not one of them was born here in this country, but they come from families that are multi-generational, from countries that believe in the dignity of aging and aging with respect. We've not done that very well here. Yet that's where the demand is going to be. So almost like teaching where we don't pay very well for something that is foundational and it has the importance of creating new jobs and creating the workforce of the future. Caregiving, we don't pay well, but it's where we will see growth because any of those other roles that are more technical that can be supported by automation, they're not going to go away, but you're going to hire someone, that radiologist that knows how to do AI to do their job over that radiology that doesn't know how to do it. And we'll still have this gap in care And we've got to figure that out. So right now, jobs look a lot different than they did during that march, but you still understand there will be a lot of people with no work who don't want to do those jobs because they feel you can't make a living on these jobs that are less than $20 an hour, but which will be the highest need. Human, we talk about artificial intelligence, right? But we're going to need more of this advanced interaction work where it's human to human, and the people willing to do those jobs are the ones that we need in the workforce. So we need a whole PR campaign around the importance of those roles while figuring out a way to pay better so those people can have the dignity of jobs where they can take care of their families and take care of our families too.
That's a great part about the PR campaign. In fact, it makes me think differently about the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That really was PR in a different way we think about it. You mentioned trust fund. When I was in college, a friend of mine was talking to my roommate about a trust fund. I had never heard of it. I returned home for Christmas and I talked to my parents. I said, my roommate is talking to me about a trust fund. I said, do we have a trust fund? My father looked at my mother. He looked at me. He said, son, when we die, you'll have no funds. Trust me. And when he died in 1998, he was serious. So, Dr. Ulrich, Dr. King wrote a lot of books. He used the pen, then the typewriter, as another way of articulating his ideas about American democracy. Talk to us more. You talked about the work with your teachers. Talk to us more about the work that you're doing to advance his ideas through scholarship and through writing.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Robinson. Well, you may know Dr. King's last book, written in 1967, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And in that monograph, Dr. King talked about this concept. He described this concept called the beloved community. And within the beloved community, he imagined a community in which all people, regardless of race, creed, color, ethnicity, would come together as one. And as part of this beloved community, he saw that within a larger paradigm or framework called the World House. And how do you get to that World House? Dr. King said it was not going to be by the people who were out front the most. It was going to happen by the work of foot soldiers, such as people who worked in the community workers, and teachers. So I see the work that I'm doing here at UVA with the Teachers in the Movement project, which I hope will be the Teachers in the Movement Institute soon, as contributing to this larger global vision of the role that teachers can play in bringing about the beloved community and the World House. And one of the challenges I have when I reach out to some of these teachers and I call them and say, hey, can I come down and talk to you about the work that you did in the community in the 50s and 60s? Because some of these people are over 100 years old. And they'll say, why would you want to interview me? I didn't do anything. I was just teaching. And I said, were you an activist? No, I wasn't an activist. I was just doing what I thought was right. I was teaching these kids. And I said, let me come talk to you anyway. Students and I would like to come down. And we would go down and talk to them, and they would tell these fascinating stories. And on occasion, they would tell us stories like, yeah, I remember meeting Dr. King one time in Danville, Virginia. That was a story I heard. Or I met Dr. King and shook his hand in Atlanta, Georgia. And I even had one person that I interviewed said, he told me, he said, yeah, I remember one time I took this class with King, and I think it was 1961 at Morehouse. I said, what? He said, yes. And I said, wow, that's incredible. He said, you want to see the syllabus for the course? And he pulled the syllabus out and showed it to me. And he reminded me something that Dr. King said about the importance of education itself. Dr. King was so impressed with his own teachers and educators like Benjamin E. Mays that he himself thought and fantasized about becoming a teacher one day. He often, not often, but occasionally talked to his wife, Coretta, about this idea that one day, when this is all over, maybe I'll teach at one of these universities and colleges and I'll be a teacher. But we all know that that was not it. But I like to think that the teachers that I am interviewing are fulfilling Dr. King's desire in their work as teachers. So that's where I see my contribution, is bringing these stories to light. And I tell you, one of the most important things that always happens to me, I would say at least once a month, I get a letter, a phone call, or an email or text from someone who will say, you remember when you interviewed my mother in 2015? I said, yeah. I said, thank you. That is the only recording, only video that we have of her. It's the only recording of her voice that we have. So we want to thank you and your students at UVA for doing this work. So I think that is what inspires me to continue this work and to try to think about what King meant about the beloved community and to try to fulfill his dream of the World House.
I tell my students, some of them who are in the audience now, I'm a lifelong learner. This is the first time I've heard of Dr. King actually teaching anything at Morehouse, and he would have definitely, surely have been a great teacher. So, Professor Robinson, you mentioned your own family decided to move you from one state to another because of education. You also learned from Professor Bond that, yeah, maybe there's still some challenges taking place in K-12 education. I remember reading one of Dr. King's stories about having to have a tough conversation with his daughter about why she couldn't go to Funtown. And we forget that he was also a dad through it all. What are you doing through your institute in particular to help us talk about race and other issues, particularly at a time where some of those terms are considered taboo, to advance the Funtown of his day to address the Funtown of now?
Yeah, so great question. You know, so I founded and now direct the Education Rights Institute at the University of Virginia School of Law, and we focus on several issues that are relevant to King's legacy. So first, we focus on ensuring that all students have access to a high quality education. So King was very much for things like speedy desegregation when that was taking place. But he also understood the need for equalizing schools. You know, the idea of desegregation was not simply to have children sit by one another. The lawyers who brought the litigation for Brown were really very much focused on the idea that green follows white. In other words, the money was following the white students and creating higher quality schools. And so desegregation was meant to give the black students and other students access to a higher quality education. And that included everything from the school buildings, which were inferior in black schools, to the resources, the textbooks that were more up to date, lab equipment, everything. And the unfortunate challenge that we face today, and why I founded the Institute, is that we still have significant disparities in educational opportunity that reflect lines of race. They also reflect lines of socioeconomic status. You know, wealthier families, not all of them have a trust fund, but wealthier ones, get access to a higher quality education than lower income students. And we also have geographic divides. So many rural students are left behind with lower quality education. They're often even left out of the conversation. Many urban students are in schools that are older buildings that need to be replaced, repaired, things like that. And so we work at the Education Rights Institute on a couple issues related to race. In addition to making sure all students get a high quality education, we focus on opportunity gaps. We issue reports, and we also do videos and one-page summaries that explain opportunity gaps that reflect geography, race, and socioeconomic status. And then this year, we're going to begin partnering with school districts to help them measure and close opportunity gaps to make sure that students are receiving equal education opportunity. And then the second thing that we do is we are helping people understand and implement, and school districts understand and implement, teachers and others, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And here's why. Title VI, before it started making headlines in 2025, really wasn't talked about much in school. And remember, we started well before this recent use of Title VI. Title VI it protects students from race, color, and national origin discrimination if your school district receives federal funds. The challenge with that statute is the school districts rely on people like me, the general counsel, to comply with Title VI, which is, did we check the box? Did we make sure no one's told at the door you can't come in? are we not, discriminating in a variety of ways? But they're not doing a really fulsome examination of what equal educational opportunity can truly mean. And the Education Rights Institute is seeking to change that. And so by pairing Title VI with opportunity gaps, what we're seeking is to help districts examine who's getting access to AP classes. So Professor Robinson and I have 3 daughters. And one of our daughters is at a local high school, and she shared with us, Mom, I'm the only one in my AP physics class. I'm the only one in my calculus, only black child, she's saying, in my calculus AP class, right? And so this is in 2026 that she's still experiencing this. And she is in a minority high school. So that tells you where the opportunity, there's a divide that started really early in who was prepared to go into calculus and who wasn't. And so those are some of the issues we work on at the Education Rights Institute, and really excited about the work, and excited I actually put bookmarks on everyone's chair so you can learn about it. Please follow us. We're doing great work, and hope you'll keep up with what we're doing.
And Professor Robinson mentioned that we have 3 daughters. The fact that they're in the strong academic classes is from my side of the family. We just add that on there. One of the many things I appreciate about Emily's professional career is not only your ability to pivot, but you're looking sometimes 5 years ahead. Employers matter. They matter in ways we often don't think about. HR matters a lot. Tell us, 5 years ahead, what should we as a community do to better align, to support the kind of work you're doing, to create the kind of beloved community we're here to talk about?
So if I can give, how many people in here are retired with a little time on your hands? When have you last visited the Career Services office on the campus of your local university? Anybody been by there recently? I bet you it looks the same. So we were talking about this, and this is low-hanging fruit. So the privilege of having worked I worked at a campus called Fayetteville State University, 7 miles from Fort Bragg. Historically black college, but because of its military affiliation, one of the most diverse because of the military affiliated spouses and dependents who attended. And we had to be different there because we understood the importance of portable degrees.
Yes.
Because at any moment that spouse could be PCS, right?
Yep.
And the spouse, that is the trailing spouse, needed a degree where they could get a job where they were going. So teaching, nursing were the big ones. And so those departments tended to have their own, thing. They didn't really depend on career services as much. But if you go into career services offices right now, where they were founded and created so that they could assist the current students, but also alumni, most of them don't have the resources to do so. And there is a huge gap between what is happening in the workplace today and the resources and knowledge being provided to students who are seeking support from the Career Services Office. And in my view, I think HR professionals should be running those offices. And I think our career services professionals should receive the same training. And I think they should be spending their summers in workplaces, in the industries that are adjacent to their campuses and universities. Having kind of grown up in a state university system,
Okay.
you understand that there's an expected ROI, that if these students are matriculating at a cheaper rate through our state system and receiving legislative dollars to attend, that these students should stay in that state and give back as tax-paying workers in that economy. That's the expectation of our legislators now, right? They want to see the ROI if they're going to release the purse strings. If our campuses are not engaged like this with their local industry to see what's happening and where it's going and getting the students trained, they'll never see that ROI. And we may likely not see the continued investment. And what you're also seeing in our state legislatures is where there was a time, and I can speak for North Carolina because I was there for so long, where most of the members of the legislature were graduates of the schools in the state, and there was this blind allegiance, of course I'm going to fund. You're now seeing people who either don't have the college degree, didn't go to school in the state, have no allegiance to any of them, could care less, and they're treating it like any other state investment. If I'm investing $1 billion every year in our public university system, the majority of those people better graduate and give back to our state through work. How can we do that? How can we, because that's when you got a legislature that's 100% Republican, and I'm policy, not politics, but you got to understand what you're dealing with. And that's the way they think about it. That this is not just the right thing to do, that there has to be an ROI. We have to start thinking about how we provide that ROI. So for citizens like you who spend a free day coming to something like this, which is amazing, you're the citizen I want to be visiting that campus and saying, how can I help? Does my relationship with my former employer who's local, can I help make a connection between you and somebody in the HR office there and create an opportunity for the career services and the professors? Let's not talk about how the syllabus shouldn't be 10 years old. I'm immediate past chair of my alma mater's board of trustees. And so one of the things I would say is you can't have a syllabus that's 10 years old in an economy that is changing at the speed of light. And how do you get help when you're in industry, going into the halls of those businesses and learning what it's taking for them to do business and teaching those skills? So I would urge each of you, just a low-hanging fruit in what I see, if this is to work, is I see career services offices actually becoming the heart of those campuses, that external engagement and that internal engagement that you need so that you're preparing the workforce that's there. I see us at K-12 level. In high school, when you start thinking about what's next, can we please return to having some level of training for trades in our K-12?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Shop. Remember when, my dad was a mechanic, and so I remember having this Infiniti and it knocked off, and he was able to get under the hood and fix it right there. I know today, if my dad were still living, my Volvo, there's no way you get under that hood and figure it out, right? It is a very technical skill. Why should that skill not be taught in high school and someone graduate with the certification to fix these cars of today, which are what everyone's driving? Why? There's nothing wrong with that. Those are well-paying, based on what I pay when I go get the car fixed. Those are well-paying jobs, right? Yeah. The same could be saying, we understand that there are high schools in Virginia and Maryland who are now graduating people who are certified health home aides. So number one, if you're going to be in higher ed, get on our campuses, give them your insight, your knowledge of where industry is going, because you know that you've been in industry. 2, if you volunteer at a local high school or you're on the school board, run for school board, talk about the curriculum and how we've got to stop being a curriculum that only talks about prepping you for college, but it's now prepping you for the jobs of the future, the gray and the old school blue jobs that require some type of technical knowledge that doesn't require an immediate 4-year degree. And then number 3, I would say support programs in your community that support untapped pools of talent. Who are those people? You're formerly incarcerated. You're people who are living with disabilities. Your students who have already graduated but don't have the GED, who are not thriving in the workplaces. So volunteer your time with those groups. The great thing about COVID? During COVID, so many people with disabilities were able to be hired for remote work. And I'm going to go back to that dignity of work.
Good point.
Right? The ability to be able to be a call center person, whatever it was, and to provide for their families in spite of their physical ailments or whatever it is that labels them as disabled. And so we all have a part to play, because guess what? We're not letting a lot of people here. We're not having a lot of babies. We've got to deal with the workforce we have that's already been born in this country. We've got to get people trained to look just beyond the degree. But if they are going to do a degree, that they're getting degrees in positions that are going to help industry. And one last thing, I don't want to. Soft skills. You used to call them soft skills. We call them power skills. Where you can influence the life of a young person so that they understand things like collaboration, critical thinking, right? The number one thing I say to some of our younger employees is, you don't know how to connect the dots. And they don't. Like, they'll see an issue and they freeze because there's been no discussion about how you make the connections and think critically. All right, how the importance of lifelong learning and that you don't know it all just because you finally graduated. These power skills, adaptability.
Right.
That every time something changes, you can't have a meltdown. That just because when I hired you and I told you that this was the way your job was going to be, but we got a brand new contract and your job needs to be this, that you can't say you lied to me, right? That adaptability, there are these skills, we call them soft skills for too long. Your power skills are going to be the skills that you use to survive as we look at a workforce that is heightened by leveraging AI. Because you're going to need those power skills no matter what it is that you're doing in the workplace.
Great points.
Great.
Oh, yeah. The trade part is real. My stepdad was an airplane wing mechanic for 47 years. High school diploma. Today, he probably couldn't get that job if he were alive.
It would just be different.
It would be
It
different.
would be different.
Yeah. Dr. Ulrich, looking ahead, higher education and scholarship. What are you thinking?
Yes, I think, as I think about Dr. King again and his vision of the beloved community and the World House, I think he would be concerned with many things that are happening in the country now that I won't go into in detail, but as it pertains to education, I can foresee him also being concerned about how we are viewing humanities education, mainly because he had a very humanistic or humanities educational background. As we know, he was trained at Morehouse under Benjamin E. Mays, later went to Crozer Theological Seminary, Philadelphia, then to Boston University. And he received a very eclectic educational background and training, a broad-based education that I believe trained him, gave him the soft skills as well as the philosophical skills to attack the race problem. So much so that the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois said of King that he is a young man using Gandhian technique. He's a pragmatic philosopher. So to Du Bois, he looked at King as being a philosopher, which I thought was interesting. And I think that part of King's vision needs to come into our vision as we think about education for people in the future. We certainly must have people trained to do the work of the everyday person, but we also need to lean into giving people the humanities education that gives people those critical skills. So I think he would be concerned about that.
An equally good asset and add to the fact that the philosopher part of King, we hadn't thought about when he was at Boston University, he studied under Howard Thurman.
That's right.
Who was the first African American to meet Gandhi. And before he left, Gandhi said, oh, by the way, the nonviolent movement as we now know it will come through the Negroes, the term at the time. And he looked at him and said, you got to be kidding. He says, no, it's going to come through the Negroes in the United States. And he told his friends, they all laughed. He then left Howard University, where he was dean, became the first black dean at University of Boston. And lo and behold, a guy named Martin Luther King decides to enroll in Boston College. And the rest is history. And so thank you so much for reminding us about the philosophy and the nonviolence. Professor Robinson, K-12 education, future law, what can we do to help King's education mountaintop vision come alive?
Yeah, so I think one thing that we haven't talked about yet, but I think that's really important, particularly as we're here at the Miller Center, is that King was very much understood the importance of education for preparing engaged civic participants. He tied education to democracy. You know, there is no democracy without educated individuals to hold officials accountable, to understand the issues that they're voting on, to participate in not only elections at all levels, to be engaged with officials about what needs to happen, whether it's at a school board meeting or a town hall meeting. And so, you know, we really also have to recognize that in addition to preparing students for both college and career, and I completely agree with you, that's one of our missions at the Education Rights Institute, is college and career. It's not just college, But also, the other aim that we focus on is preparing engaged civic participants. And one of the things that you see when you look at the evolution of K-12 education is that the shift and focus on standardized testing really elevated math and science, which is very important. However, there was reduced time around social studies, around English, and other things that prepare engaged civic participants. And so the challenge we have is that when we have this imbalance in teaching students to be ready to go fulfill their civic duties, students then get this impression that, all of this doesn't matter, right? Many students now, see that in their local communities they can make a difference, but do they believe that their vote matters at the state level? Does it matter at the national level? Right? Or do they just think, I'm going to just act locally? And I think it's important to help engage young people with the need to engage in politics and democratic engagement at all levels, because all levels are affecting their lives. But if they choose to opt out, they're simply ceding that influence to others. And so I think that is something that we're focused on at the Education Rights Institute, that we're elevating in 2026. We're doing a summit about it in the fall. And so this piece of civic engagement, preparing engaged civic participants, and civic education, elevating that again so that we not only prepare students for jobs and for college, but also to be the engines of democracy that really all of us are supposed to be. But you need an education to do that well. So that's some of what is truly important, I think. And King was very much in favor of ensuring that students were educated and educated well for citizenship, and democracy.
Dr. Robinson, can I just say?
Oh, go ahead.
My presentation I did last year to probably 12 state councils at SHRM. So these are all people who are already working HR professionals. Schoolhouse Rock. 3 branches of government. I was like, I'm being this, because you're right. We assume everyone had the same really good civic education we have, but they don't. And everybody wants to be an advocate and talk politics, and you don't know the difference between the 3 branches and what can do, they don't. So you're right, we have to not just do it with the kids, we've got to do it with everyone, because there needs to be this re-education of people about civics, because there's just been this gap. So I'm so happy to hear that you're saying that.
We're going to work, you and I are going to work together. I can see that. Yeah, we got some talking to do.
I'm just a bill.
Yes,
I'm only
it
a
is.
bill. I remember that song. My children have never seen it.
Yeah.
Oh.
Right. Generational. I have a ton of questions, and they're all good questions. If I pick one over the other, it's not because I'm being mean-spirited. I'm trying to group them because there are certain themes. And so here's the first one, and this is really open for everyone. Can DEI be relabeled in a way that it can still play a role in the future of education in the workforce? That's for anyone. Started off
So
saucy.
start off with the,
Yes. Yeah.
So I don't know, I guess if you all read, our SHRM was in the paper last year for this. I don't know if you know that. Right? So July 2024, we decided to be open and say that the discussion needs to be about I and D. Now, if you take it back to 2018, when we arrived at SHRM, we made a decision to change the diversity conference to the inclusion conference. We said diversity is the metric, right? That's what's in the chart, and you're saying I can check these boxes. Inclusion is the goal of making the workplace someplace where everyone feels included and their POV is included. Everyone wants to be included in some way. So we came out and said that we should not drop the E, we would still be talking about equity, but equity, because the way the term is understood and misunderstood, was making people who even wanted to support DEI kind of gloss over, because they didn't want to have to deal with everyone's misperception. But I and D, we could absolutely define. It caused such a storm on LinkedIn, especially, that we were dropping the E, we were anti. Now, I don't know if you know about us. So our number 1 is a black male from Miami. Number 2, I'm a black female. Like, it's not, we have a very diverse board. It was an understanding that we saw where corporate America was going, And we saw that people were tired and that all the efforts for DE&I were excluding groups of people. And we should focus on inclusionary environments. Right now, we're continuing to use the term IND. We bought an entity called CEO Action. I don't think you know this. CEO Action
That's what we have you here.
for diversity and inclusion. We bought this entity, and what we're working on now is figuring out a way to communicate to CEOs what their workforces should look like, because the demographics are the demographics. We can say all day what we'd like to say, what we'd like to see. Whoever's here now, already birthed and on the ground, that's the workforce we have to deal with. That's the workforce you're trying to recruit for. And that workforce looks really different today than it did 10, 20, 30 years ago. So it's really pragmatic and practical. How do you do it? By making everyone feel included. And Dr. Robinson mentioned something earlier about how even that example about rural students, we spend so much time focusing on the diversity that we can see. We forget that we have left generations of people behind in rural America who ultimately have felt non-included and forgotten. And having worked for the UNC system, 15 years ago, they were doing research on this. And think about this. You leave your small rural town in North Carolina, you come down to, what's the big city there? Is Chapel Hill, Raleigh. You go to college, you stay, you don't go home except for holidays. Who have you left behind? Cousin Jim is at the farmstead with aunt and uncle who are very old, who never leave, and someone's got to take them to their doctor's appointments. That person has never been allowed to thrive outside, and here you are living this life, coming home, spouting whatever you want that sounds very liberal and that you don't understand what is bothering them. The fact that the hospital that used to be up the street now is 10 miles down the road because it's going to be where the people who are living in suburbia and are white collar and have the big houses closer to them. This is really happening. People have been left behind, and we've been so focused on what we can see as opposed to their experiences. And so I think I always say that word diversity is much more than the things we can see. Professor Jim Johnson in the School of Business at UNC Chapel Hill does this study on iceberg demographics. And if we start thinking about diversity as to what's below, what's underneath, as opposed to what's up top, there'll be far more we find in common. In common in our workplaces today are people who are dealing with being caregivers, people who are dealing with being men who are single parents. We never thought about having groups of men that can support. I work for a male single parent who has raised his child since the day she was born. What he went through during COVID is a lot different than me as a married person with no kids. It was fun in my house, right? My husband and I like each other. We had a good time, right? He had a preteen in his house 24 hours, and he's the only parent. There are all these things that we don't understand about our coworkers that go beyond what you can see. And so, long-winded way to say, but just to say that there's so much we've got to think more broadly about. And so if you're interested in Dr. Jim Johnson, he's a demographer by trade, but he really is talking about that we've got to start looking at diversity about the things you don't see that we all have in common, and that'll bring more people along.
Great points.
Yeah, so I would say, one, I actually really don't see the ground that we need to get rid of this terms diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that really, although that has been a very effective campaign, I think that, the terms, if you look at the meaning of them, are really seeking to operationalize some of the first principles some of our first principles. So if you look at the Brown versus Board of Education decision, what they talk about there is equal educational opportunity, equal protection of the laws, right? And so the question is, how do you go about that? How do you actually bring to life these principles? And so I think that we need to have, regardless of what you call it, I think we do need efforts that address the inequalities that we have in our society and that build toward a inclusive or equal, or whatever adjective you want to place upon it, but a highly functioning, democracy, economy, and society. And if we continue to allow the stratifications that we have, given our demographics, so in our K-12 schools across the nation, there are more students of color than there are white students. If students of color continue to receive inferior educational opportunities, where do you think our nation is headed? Where is our nation headed, right? But if we embrace a true and more fulsome understanding of equal educational opportunity, where it's not just students of color, but all students, including the rural students, right? Including students that are often not thought of, students with disabilities, other students, are included in preparing them to be college and career ready and engaged civic participants, then we can sort of bring everyone together along. But I think part of what's wrong in education is that it's presented as this pitting one group against the other. And we have a lot of shared common interests in education. You know, we have, Professor Robinson and I's parents have a lot in common with rural parents who want a high quality education for their kids. We want the same thing, right? And so I think it's recognizing our common need for a strong democracy, economy, and society that will help us make those changes that benefit everyone. It is not about benefiting one group over the other. It is not a zero-sum game, K-12 education. And I would say higher education also is not a zero-sum game. And so I think that's part of what we have to understand about the need for reform today, is that we have to address these systemic inequalities to move us toward the democracy and economy and society that we all need and want.
Thank you. This question is for Professors Robinson and Ulrich. What can faculty at the law school and the ed school do to support teachers in the role they're in right now? It's tough for a whole lot of reasons, but what can we do?
I'll start. I think it was in maybe 2020, I received an email from one of my students who was a graduate of UVA. And she said, I am teaching at a school in Chicago. And she's white. And she said, and I'm teaching, most of my kids are African American and Latino. And she said, I am having a difficult time engaging them, their parents, and the history and the culture. Can you send me some materials that might help me? I said, it's not the materials that will help you. It's getting to know the parents and the history and the culture that you mentioned. And that email made me think about what colleges of education, not just at UVA. Let me just say, I think UVA is making some strides in this direction, the School of Education. But I think we need to offer our teachers, our prospective teachers, an education that will train them so that when they go into these environments and they're not from the Black community or the Latino community or what have you, that they have a understanding of what they're getting into, but more importantly, they learn how to engage. And I don't think that schools of education have done a good job of this overall. I was at the University of Georgia, and this was an issue there as well. So what I would like to see over the next few years is for us to offer more courses that deal with issues of culture, race, ethnicity, etc., to prepare students. And that's going to be a challenge because, as you know, if you're in a state school, the curriculum is already set. And many times the students will tell me, I would love to take your course, but I don't have any electives to take. So unfortunately, I can't take your course on the history of African American education. I can't even take your course on the history of American education. So that's a challenge and something that we need to deal with in a very systemic way.
You know, one of the things the legal profession has moved toward in recent years is cultural competency. And training lawyers who are culturally competent, because they have to be able to engage with not just their clients, but diverse juries. You know, you're doing discovery, you're going out into communities. You need to be able to do your job, you have to have some cultural competency. So that is something that the legal profession is doing. For teachers, I can tell you that at the Education Rights Institute, some of the things that we are doing is we offer webinars that are that provide very clear and straightforward, we really leave out the legal jargon, explanations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act so that teachers understand it. So we had over 500 teachers register for our webinar this fall, and we're doing others this year. And so we are seeking to take the law out of law schools and put them into the hands of teachers so that they can understand these are the rights of your students and here's how you can bring those those rights to life. And so we provide, when we do reports, we do a one-page summary. We do them specifically for educators, and then we tailor them also for district leaders. So we're very focused on supporting teachers in the classroom to help them address the issues that we are specifically focused on and to hand them the tools. We give action items and all those resources. Here's what you can do to bring equal education to life, to take equal educational opportunity from rhetoric to reality. And teachers are very much at the front line of that. And I think that is part of what one of the challenges is and why we're starting to partner with schools of education, is that's not something that's often taught at schools of education. But we want teachers to understand their role in that work.
Something you want to say?
That's amazing.
So last question, and I'm going to link it in with some others. So Dr. King spent a lot of time working with leaders in Washington, D.C. With current talk of abolishing the Department of Ed, what that will mean for the Office of Civil Rights, what recommendations do you have to help us think about how to work and navigate Washington at this time?
That's a tough one.
I'm going to say learn the language, learn how you.
Okay.
So I think part of the issue is that it's easy to keep talking about things in the same ways that we've always talked about them. And we've got to be more creative in how we talk about and know who you're talking, know who your audience is when you're talking about the issues. We have to acknowledge the Department of Education could do a little bit better.
Sure.
But we also know that it has stood as a vanguard to support the things that Professor Robinson has been talking about as well. And so there is an importance there. But we also know that states impact you at a level, your life, at a level even more than the federal government. Federal government gets the attention, but I kid you not, we have got to pay attention to the states. You know, I'll say, for example, North Carolina, the state superintendent role for years, people were like, oh, it's not that important. It is important who gets in. You just can't have anybody, who's never been in a school running to be the state school superintendent. Your school boards, I do this in the HR in front of our folk all the time. I want people who understand work, understand humans to be on the school board. Your local government, those people who tax you more than the federal government in some instances, we've got to start paying attention. I think we put so much attention on the headlines and what's going on in DC that we forget the impact of your state Supreme Courts. Nothing gets to the Supreme Court unless it goes through your state Supreme Court at some point. So who is appointed and elected there starts the clock on whether you're going to get what your community actually needs and whether it gets in front of the Supreme Court. So if you've got the right people there, but my husband and I argue about this all the time, but I'm a firm, he's like, but Supreme Court's for life. I'm like, yeah, okay, it is. But these issues don't make their way out of your state and become things that could end up in the appellate court and ultimately on the docket of the Supreme Court if you don't have the right people in those seats. So my thing is, yes, it's nice to be able to talk to folk in DC, and when you have to understand who you're talking to when you go there and make sure you know the words, because their eyes will glass over and then they won't hear anything you're saying. So you are going to tailor that conversation for the person you're talking to. But number two, please pay more attention to who you're electing in your states. Governor, all of those roles all the way down, because they're going to impact you at a much greater level. Why do you see all these people leaving Congress and running for governor? They understand that 2 years in the House, they can't get much done because they're always running. So where could they have the power and be the buck stops here as the head of that state? So you got to see what's happening there and really focus.
Professor Ulrich, now I'm thinking about it, you've submitted and have won grants. And even with the possible abolition of Department of Ed, Department of Ed gives a lot of money away. Any advice you can give to scholars who are thinking about how, if that happens, how should I think creatively about raising funds to support my research?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about for quite some time. I encourage scholars to not limit themselves to the typical foundations or to the School of Ed.
Okay.
I'm already thinking about this for the Teachers in the Movement Institute. You can go to local power companies. You can go to different organizations who may be willing to fund your work with not as many strings attached and not as many hoops to jump. So I would encourage people to expand their idea of what of grant making or receiving grants, and not limit to the School of Education. I mean, to the Department of Education, because it always comes with some caveat.
Got it. You work in the U.S. Department of Education. If there's no education, is there no civil rights?
So I think it's important to understand what's happened with at the federal level, given the focus of that question. You know, the enforcement of civil rights was shifted over to Department of Justice, but there was a large firing, a reduction in force of attorneys. So one thing to understand is that before this happened, so before 2025, we did not have a well-staffed Office of Civil Rights. And so even though the Office of Civil Rights has for decades done very important work and has held many school districts accountable, they did not have the capacity, even before the reduction in force, to effectively enforce student civil rights. So you can see why, as when I developed an institute, I said, we need teachers, we need principals, we need school districts to understand what's required, because the Office of Civil Rights, even if someone clicked a switch and put it back in place as it was not able to effectively support the civil rights of all students. That actually requires an understanding of the law at the local level, and then holding leaders accountable for actually enforcing student civil rights. And so it is important to understand and keep track of what's happening in Washington, because it does affect our communities. And what we're seeing in the news around schools is that things like racial harassment and other things are increasing, because they're like, well, the federal government's not going to hold us accountable. We sort of feel like we can say and do what we want, right? The Office of Civil Rights is gutted. They're not coming for us, right? But the thing that people often miss is there are state laws, just as Emily's saying, that prohibit, racial harassment, national origin harassment, all those things. So there are state laws that can be enforced. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, if it's intentional discrimination, you can go into federal court with that. And so it's not just the Office of Civil Rights that enforces student civil rights. We need a much broader understanding of what that involves. And I think even when we had a strong office and it was doing, really effective work, it was not reaching the full scope of students. They had more, they had just a record number of complaints, 10, I don't remember the exact number, but just a record number. I think it was over 20,000. And they're only able to close and enforce so many, even when they had a fully functioning office. Right. So it is important at the state and local level to address those issues.
Well, all good things must come to an end. We're now at 12:15. Again, first of all, let me thank the leadership of Miller Center. Let me thank UVA's Lifelong Learning. Let me thank also the Office of Engagement. All of you who decided to take time out to come here in person, those of you who are in the viewing audience. Before we give a round of applause to our three panelists, when Dr. King said in his last few words, I may not get there with you, my takeaway is I may not get there with you. We are the you. We're still here. And what we can do as the you is to be we and to continue to move forward. And so with that, let's give a round of applause for our panelists. This concludes our events, and some of them will actually remain here if you have any additional questions. Thank you.